Sometimes remakes get a bad rap. They can, in fact, be good. 1960's The Magnificent Seven, directed by John Sturges, is an Old West remake of Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai and is an excellent movie. Steven Soderbergh's Ocean's 11 is better than Lewis Milestone's 1960 version starring the Rat Pack, and Cecil B. DeMille's 1956 version of the Ten Commandments is better than his own 1923 version. But this video isn't about those kinds of movies. Instead, I want to look at the remakes that ended up being much worse than their predecessors. Most of the movies that were remade had, by the time the new versions were released, become classics. Comparisons were inevitable, and in all cases, the new ones fell short. 1954's Godzilla, directed by Ishiro Honda, is more than a simple monster movie. Released almost a decade after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the film, to great effect, used Godzilla as a metaphor for nuclear destruction. Coupled with Akira Ifukube's masterpiece score, the movie was one of the highest-grossing Japanese releases that year. While critical appreciation was slow to come in Japan, Americans loved it. According to Honda, quote, "The first film critics to appreciate Godzilla were those in the US," end quote. In the 70 years since its release, Godzilla is less a character and more of an institution. It's inspired dozens of other films, several TV shows, video games, a killer Blue Oyster Cult track, and more. It makes sense, then, that others would want a crack at reimagining Godzilla for themselves. One of the people that tried was director Roland Emmerich in 1998's Godzilla. To say that the attempt didn't go over well would be an understatement. It makes sense when you consider that Roland Emmerich didn't really care about doing the movie at all in the first place. It came down to the money, really. In his words, quote, "I didn't want to do Godzilla, but they made me a deal which was unheard of. I said, okay, let's go about this really radically. I'm not doing Big Belly Godzilla. I'm doing him as a lizard. That was supposed to tell everybody I can't do this movie," end quote. Emmerich's Godzilla ended up being a mutated lizard accidentally made by humans when they were testing atomic bombs, as opposed to being from time immemorial. That certainly added a sci-fi tone to it, and even made humans partly complicit in their own destruction. Now, that certainly could have been an interesting angle if they had explored it further. Instead, they just made Godzilla seem a lot more pedestrian than epic. Emmerich would also get rid of the atomic breath, replacing it with a fire breath. Everything that made the original Godzilla more interesting, from the build-up and sudden appearance of him in 1954, to the environmental angle that Takashi Shimura's character takes on, to the nuclear allegory of Godzilla's existence, was neutered in the service of a by-the-books monster film. The result was a disappointing box office, a cancelled trilogy, and a shellacking by critics. Now, granted, Godzilla did get much sillier as the decades went on, and I myself am a fan of the MonsterVerse movies. Godzilla and King Kong duking it out is worth every penny that I paid to see it in theaters. But 1998's Godzilla isn't trying to be silly or self-aware. I think it wants to be a great movie, but the creative forces behind it just were not up to the task. That's attested to by the fact that Dean Devlin, who co-wrote the movie and was a fan of Godzilla, admitted that they screwed up with it. I respect the fact that he was upfront about where he thought they failed. In his words, quote, "There are two flaws for me in Godzilla that really hurt the film, and both of those flaws I am responsible for. The first is we did not commit to anthropomorphizing Godzilla, meaning we did not decide if he was a heroic character or a villainous character. We made the intellectual decision to have him be neither and just simply an animal trying to survive. This was a big mistake. The second mistake was deciding to exposit the character's background in the middle of the film rather than in the first act where we always do. At the time we told the audience who these characters were, they had already made their minds up about them, and we could not change that perception. These were two serious mistakes in the writing of the film, and I take full responsibility," end quote. I find myself agreeing with Godzilla -1 director Takashi Yamazaki, who said in an interview that 1998's Godzilla was a, quote, "fun film, but I can understand the people who also say this isn't Godzilla. I think as a kaiju horror type of film, it is quite well executed. And to their credit, I think it was the first time Godzilla was rendered in a digital context and methodology, so that was a huge achievement for its time," end quote. If you don't take it too seriously as a Godzilla film, it is much better. But veteran Godzilla actor Kenpachiro Satsuma, who started his relationship with the franchise with 1971's Godzilla vs. Hedorah and eventually portrayed Godzilla during the Heisei era, said it best when he walked out of a screening for the movie, quote, "It's not Godzilla, it doesn't have his spirit," end quote. 1959's Ben-Hur, directed by William Wyler and starring Charlton Heston, is an epic among epics. It's the movie that dreams are made of, and it's best experienced on as big a screen as possible with the best sound system that you have access to. It's a remake of the 1925 silent epic Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ. Both of them are adapted from Lew Wallace's 1880 book, Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ, which is about a Jewish prince, Judah Ben-Hur, who's enslaved by Romans and becomes a charioteer and a devout Christian. Now, this does present an interesting conundrum. Do we even consider these to be remakes? I think so, because any number of adaptations of a specific work will, inevitably, be compared to, if not be virtual remakes of, a pre-existing work. John Carpenter couldn't escape it with 1982's The Thing, which was initially compared unfavorably to Christian Nyby's 1951 film, The Thing from Another World, and both of them were adapted from a 1938 novella by John W. Campbell, Who Goes There? 1959's Ben-Hur has one of the greatest set pieces of any film ever, the chariot race. Made in an age before CGI, everything had to be done practically. The set covered 18 acres, cost $1 million to construct, and involved the intense, worthwhile work of thousands of craftsmen, crew, and extras to get right. The 78 horses demanded their own vet, a harness maker, and 20 stable boys. Charlton Heston, who already knew how to ride horses, practiced charioteering 3 hours a day. The scene itself took 5 weeks to film and cost another $1 million. It was well worth it. The movie was a critical and commercial success, is one of the best movies ever made, and its 11 Academy Award wins are tied only by Titanic and Return of the King, both of them epics as well. The 2016 remake, directed by Timur Bekmambetov, starring Jack Huston and produced by MGM, which produced the other two Ben-Hurs, had neither the critical nor commercial adulation that the 1959 one had. Really, it struggled to justify its very existence. Bekmambetov tried to separate himself from the classic, saying, quote, "I read the script, and suddenly I understood this story is not what I expected. It's not a remake, it's an interpretation of the famous book," end quote. But if it has the same name without the subtitle as the original book does, the comparisons were going to be drawn no matter what. The movie had a $100 million budget, with CGI and making it 3D taking up a decent chunk of it. While they tried to honor the original by using real horses and chariots, it ended up being, as Todd McCarthy, writing for The Hollywood Reporter, said, quote, "a chariot race so heavily digitized and over-edited that it's the worst scene in the picture," end quote. The movie was a critical and commercial disaster, and it fell far short of its predecessor. Rotten Tomatoes consensus reads, quote, "How do you fight an idea? By filming a remake that has too few of its own and tries to cover it up with choppy editing and CGI," end quote. Trading the practical effects and epic nature of the original for CGI was just one of its many problems. It was 87 minutes shorter, meaning that they had to leave a lot out. To make up for that, it was edited as more of an action movie, with some shots during the chariot race lasting no longer than a couple of seconds. 1959's Ben-Hur already had the final word on the novel. 2016's Ben-Hur, like Richard Roper wrote, quote, "struggles to find an identity and never really gets there," end quote. Alfred Hitchcock's 1960 film, Psycho, was a watershed moment in film history. Made on an $806,000 budget, the movie was a massive sleeper hit, eventually raking in more than $50 million. While critical reception out of the gate wasn't fantastic, it has since been hailed as Hitchcock's most influential work and one of the greatest films ever made. Importantly, the film contributed to the further breakdown of the production code, which was a series of self-censorship rules that Hollywood adopted in order to avoid government censorship. Famously, audiences were shocked by the violence in the shower scene, but that's not the whole story. The opening shows an unmarried couple, Marion Crane and Sam Loomis, sharing a bed. The Hays Code, which had multiple sections and subsections about what you could and couldn't do, or what you should or shouldn't do, said to be careful of a man and woman in bed together. Censors didn't even like the toilet flushing. Norman Bates, played by Anthony Perkins, cross-dressing, also ended up being a cause for concern for them. Critics weren't rapturous in the beginning. Bosley Crowther, the venerable New York Times critic, said that, quote, "there is not an abundance of subtlety or the lately familiar Hitchcock bent towards significant and colorful scenery in this obviously low-budget job," end quote. A review for Time was nauseated, saying, quote, "what is offered instead is merely gruesome. The trail leads to a sagging swamp view motel and to one of the messiest, most nauseating murders ever filmed. At close range, the camera watches every twitch, gurgle, convulsion, and hemorrhage in the process by which a living human becomes a corpse," end quote. Eventually, however, they came around, and an anonymous critic for the Chicago Daily Tribune captured it best, quote, "the old pro really poured it on in this production. I'm sure the wily Mr. Hitchcock had fun making this one. He used his camera with a sharp skill to achieve shock value, the staring eye, the flowing blood, the sudden plunge of a knife. Audiences react much as they do on a high ride, giggling with nerves and excitement." End quote. Few had such kind things to say about Gus Van Sant's 1998 remake, also entitled Psycho. It was as close to a shot-by-shot remake as you could get, except it was in color, was more violent, and had new stars, with Vince Vaughn playing Norman Bates. There was almost no attempt to try and separate itself from the original. For all its issues, Roland Emmerich at least tried very hard to make his Godzilla unlike its venerable originator. The movie was a critical and commercial disaster. It was a pointless, needless remake that neither added or worse differentiated itself from its predecessor. Janet Maslin pulled some punches when she wrote that, quote, "His film is an artful, good-looking remake, a modest term, but it beats plagiarism, that shrewdly revitalizes the aspects of the real Psycho, that it follows most faithfully but seldom diverges seriously or successfully from one of the cinema's most brilliant blueprints." End quote. Jonathan Rosenbaum, a former critic at the Chicago Reader, called it a, quote, "doomed and misguided experiment," end quote, and even had harsh words for the people that try to justify its existence. Quote, "There are few films of the past decade that have irritated me quite as much as Van Sant's idiotic remake of Psycho, and in some ways I was irritated even more by the rationalizations some cinephiles came up with in their tortured efforts to justify it." End quote. Gus Van Sant would later call the movie an experiment. Could you do a shot-by-shot remake and make it successful? He had expected the backlash, saying, quote, "I was aware that there could be a backlash, but that was part of the experiment, which was to see if remaking a film as close as you could would have an effect. Backlash was thought of as good, but the results were that it wasn't as frightening as Hitchcock's film, and I attribute it to the director, me, my DNA, and the different, totally immersive style of Hitchcock. Without that, it seemed it couldn't be reproduced." End quote. It was an expensive experiment, though a part of me is glad that it exists. John Milius's 1984 classic, Red Dawn, is a historically important movie. It's the first movie that got a PG-13 rating after Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom made the creation of it necessary. It struck a bit of an apocalyptic tone and was unabashedly jingoistic, though the Cold War nature of the movie and the time in which it was released made that a lot more palpable at the time. After all, it wasn't really any more or less jingoistic than most other action movies coming out at the time. In it, an alliance of Warsaw Pact and communist Latin American countries launch an invasion of the United States. One of the landing points is a high school in Colorado. Eventually, the teens form a guerrilla group and start to fight back. The movie made $38 million on a $17 million budget and got mixed reviews from critics. Critical reception was mostly split across ideological lines. People on the left hated it, people on the right loved it, but there was certainly some crossover. A reviewer for TV Guide magazine said it was, quote, "another infantile right-wing fantasy from writer-director John Milius. This cinematic embodiment of the paranoid delusions of militarists, survivalists, and television evangelists is definitely a film for the Reagan era. Red Dawn is simply too simplistic and inept to be taken seriously." End quote. National Review, meanwhile, called it one of the best conservative movies ever made, with a blurb that in part reads, quote, "Oh no, invading commies. Laugh if you want, many do, but Red Dawn has survived countless more acclaimed films because Father Time has always been our most reliable film critic. The essence of timelessness is more than beauty. It's also truth, and the truth that America is a place and an idea worth fighting and dying for will not be denied, not under a pile of left-wing critiques or even Red Dawn's own melodramatic flaws." End quote. 2012's remake, directed by Jan Bradley, however, united both the left and the right. They all agreed that it sucked, especially when compared to the original. Trouble was apparent from the jump. In it, the invading forces were supposed to be Chinese, but MGM, fearing backlash, changed them to North Koreans, which, considering the plot of the movie, is more than a little ironic. Even with that change, it never got a release in China. But it also lost the salience of the original, which came out when the Cold War was still raging. Here, the big bad was supposed to be North Korea. A Hollywood Reporter review from the time that the movie came out noted that, quote, "The recent failure of North Korea to even launch a missile successfully lends a comic air of preposterousness to the already silly premise of Red Dawn, the long-delayed remake of John Milius's fondly remembered 1984 action film." End quote. Rather, America's most significant problems then, as now, have been domestic as opposed to the threat of invasion. The remake could have been interesting by exploring those concepts like Alex Garland's Civil War would more than a decade later. Instead, it chose to be a cheap imitation of the original without the conviction that Milius brought to it. It's little wonder that it fell at the box office. 1951's The Day the Earth Stood Still, directed by Robert Wise, is one of my favorite sci-fi films ever made, and I don't think I'm wrong in saying that it's one of the best sci-fi films ever made, bar none. Another Cold War film, this one doesn't have the action and violence of Red Dawn. Rather, it's more of a mirror held up to humanity and their potential for destruction. It, like some Godzilla films, wants people to confront their self-destructive tendencies. It centers around an alien, Klaatu, who comes to Earth in peace and with goodwill, but warns mankind against their heightening aggression or else. The message was one of peace through restraint as opposed to spectacle. Considering that mutually assured destruction and saber-rattling were mainstays of the Cold War, it's safe to say that the $1.85 million gross meant that not all the right people saw it. Those who did see it, though, loved it. Arthur C. Clarke, one of the best sci-fi writers in history, hailed it as one of his 12 favorite sci-fi films. Harrison's Reports, a movie trade magazine that's been defunct since the 1960s, was exuberant in praise, quote, "Very good. It is by far the best of the science fiction pictures yet produced. It holds one's interests undiminished from start to finish, and although the theme is admittedly fantastic, one is made to feel as if he is seeing a real-life occurrence because of the expert handling of the subject matter and the extremely fine special effects work," end quote. The 2008 remake, directed by Scott Derrickson and starring Keanu Reeves, doesn't really have the same weight. Unlike many of the other movies on this list, this one was a surefire commercial hit, raking in $233 million on an $80 million budget. As opposed to dealing with the nuclear fears of the first movie, Klaatu's goal now is to save Earth from environmental destruction. But while Klaatu's intention in the original wasn't exactly subtle, his intention in the new version was much more, for lack of a better word, destructive. Humans, he thought, had wasted the time that they had, so he intended to eradicate them and reintroduce life later on. Gone was the restraint of the original, replaced with CGI destruction and tepid melodrama. Negative reviews came from all corners. The Wall Street Journal wrote, quote, "What's never explained is why anyone would do such a dumb remake of Robert Wise's 1951 sci-fi classic," end quote. Salon called it, quote, "a jumble of spare parts and leftover dialogue, as if it had been assembled out of unused bits of every movie where an unknown what's-it threatens our way of life and the government goes into full institutional pants-crapping panic mode," end quote. But Richard Schickel, writing for Time, was the most unrelenting. In his words, quote, "Suffice it to say that these morons have, quite simply, turned the day the earth stood still on its head, and what's falling out of its pockets in that upended state is a stream of junk. It does not have the charm of what little boys sometimes carry around with them, but rather the nasty glitter of inept box office calculation. I suppose that doesn't make a lot of difference. The tradition of stupid remakes is a long and undistinguished one, but some of us do have good movie memories and strong affection for the indelible impressions left on us by the populist triumphs of the past," end quote. The remake mistook spectacle for significance, opting for bombast where restraint was necessary. The result was an eco-themed warning that never resonated. It tried to go big, but it still got lost in its predecessor's eminent shadow. 1973's The Wicker Man, directed by Robin Hardy and starring Edward Woodward and Christopher Lee, is an iconic horror film. Cinefantastique called it the Citizen Kane of horror movies, and it's since been hailed as one of the best horror movies ever made. Set on a Scottish island, it follows a devout Christian officer investigating the disappearance of a young girl, only to find a pagan society harboring a sinister secret. A decidedly folk horror film, it builds tension through its eerie tone, a sense of isolation, and a general sense of unease. Christopher Lee, one of the greatest actors to ever grace the silver screen, played Lord Summerisle, a villainous role he really sank his teeth into. Lee would call it his best film, which is saying something for someone with more than 275 film roles. While it didn't make much of a splash at the box office, critical reception would end up being something else. Critics didn't just call it good or great, they hailed it as a masterpiece. Adam Smith, writing for Empire, said that, quote, "The Wicker Man is, more than anything else, a film about what people can do in the name of religion or, more generally, belief. Its power comes not from appeals to the supernatural, but from a deep understanding of our own undeniable nature. Horror doesn't get much closer to home than that," end quote. TV Guide wrote that, quote, "The Wicker Man is intelligent entertainment that takes its subject seriously without resorting to gratuitous effects to make a point. It remains a fine example of a cult horror that remains with the viewer well past its conclusion," end quote. And the aptly named David Fear, running for Time Out, wrote that, quote, "It remains a how-to model for making something that fancies itself a slow-burn thriller, until it isn't slow-burning whatsoever," end quote. The same adulation was unavailable for the 2006 remake directed by Neil LaBute and starring Nicolas Cage and Ellen Burstyn. It kept many of the same basic elements as the original, but instead of Lord Summerisle on a remote Scottish island, we had Sister Summerisle in the Pacific Northwest. And instead of the magnetic, imposing performance of Christopher Lee, we got a bizarre, though amusing emphasis on bees. The attempt was likely doomed from the start. For one, it had zero buy-in from either Robin Hardy or Christopher Lee, the latter of whom said, quote, I don't believe in remakes. You can make a follow-up to a film, but to remake a movie with such history and success just doesn't make sense to me, end quote. Even Nicolas Cage, in retrospect, called the movie absurd. Tonally, the 2006 version is different. The original was a slow-burn mystery that built dread bit by bit before eventually reaching its shocking conclusion. The remake, some thought, was unintentional comedy, though Cage later said, quote, "I'm going on record right now. That is not a fact. Neil and I both knew how funny it was," end quote. Like the original, it also failed to make money. Critics, meanwhile, were unrelenting. Dana Stevens, writing for the New York Times, said, quote, "A movie like this can survive an absurd premise, but not incompetent execution. And Mr. LaBute, never much of an artist with a camera, proves almost comically inept as a horror movie technician. It's neither haunting nor amusing, just boring," end quote. And Jack Matthews, writing for the New York Daily News, wrote, quote, "As an allegory of religious conflict, the 73 film is brilliantly constructed and ends with a punctuation mark that was shocking in its day. LaBute's movie attempts to shock, as well, and does. Given the names involved and the casting of Cage, it is shockingly bad," end quote. The best thing to do is take the advice of Mark Savlov, writing for the Austin Chronicle, quote, "Do yourself a favor. Go rent Hardy's original film, watch it, and then try and get it out of your head. You never, ever will," end quote. That bit of advice from Savlov is true for a lot of these movies. The originals for most of these movies are likely to stick with you for the long term. I know that that's the case for me. Most of them broke new ground and shaped a lasting legacy for themselves. It makes sense why studios or other directors would want to remake them, if only to capture some of that old school magic. In most cases, though, that doesn't turn out well. Remakes are almost always negatively compared to the movie that came before them, especially if they have nothing new to offer like these ones. Better to make a sequel at that point.